The sea was black that night, a cold November darkness stretching endlessly beyond the submarine's thin steel hull. Somewhere above, a shape moved through the Pacific like a drifting continent, massive, silent, and unaware of the eyes watching it from the depths. Inside the control room, the hum of machinery faded into the kind of stillness that makes every breath feel borrowed. Men who had not slept in hours stood rigid at their stations, sensing that history was coiling itself around them in the dark. Yet this moment, this quiet heartbeat before a decision, held a paradox. Only 2 years earlier, American submarines in World War II had fired torpedoes that hit their marks and simply failed. Weapons meant to shatter steel had tapped enemy hulls with hollow thuds before sinking uselessly into the deep. The men had done everything right. The ocean had done nothing wrong. Their technology had betrayed them. So how did a force once crippled by its own torpedoes become the blade that cut the Japanese empire from beneath? And what chain of choices, courage, and bitter lessons led to the night when an American submarine would face a giant no one even knew existed? When dawn broke over Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Pacific Fleet lay wounded beneath columns of smoke. Battleships burned in their berths. Oil fires curled upward into the morning sky. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. Yet amid the devastation, two things had survived almost untouched: the submarine base and the vast fuel tanks that would power the coming counteroffensive. In that unlikely stroke of fortune, the United States had found the one weapon still poised to strike back immediately. Within hours, President Franklin Roosevelt issued a doctrine the Navy had never before embraced: unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Every merchant ship, every troop transport, every warship in waters controlled by the Axis was now a legitimate target. The intention was bold and brutally simple. American submarines in World War II would sever Japan's lifelines just as German U-boats attempted to strangle Britain. What no one predicted was how unprepared the United States was for the campaign it had just unleashed. The early patrols revealed a problem so fundamental it bordered on catastrophic. Submariners executed flawless approaches, identifying targets, calculating angles, firing spreads at perfect torpedo depth, only to watch their shots strike with a dull metallic thud and sink without detonating. Commanders like Frederick Warder of the USS Seawolf documented case after case. The light cruiser Naka was caught at anchor. Torpedoes hit her hull cleanly, yet the cruiser escaped with barely a scratch. Approaches that would have defined a tactician's career ended in disbelief. The frustration ate at the men. Every patrol meant threading through waters thick with aircraft, destroyers, and minefields. Every attack exposed them to counterfire. And when the moment of decision came, when a captain committed his boat and his crew to mortal risk, their primary weapons simply failed them. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted nothing was wrong. Captains, they said, were missing. Crews were untrained. Maintenance was sloppy. Human error was to blame. But the men who lived beneath the waves knew better. They heard the unmistakable sound of steel on steel. They watched enemy ships continue unscathed through their periscopes. They knew the patterns, the distances, the rhythm of an attack. Something deeper, something mechanical, structural, concealed, was crippling the submarine force at its very foundation. And the consequences were strategic as well as personal. Japan's merchant fleet roamed the Pacific with near impunity throughout 1942. Convoys that should have been devastated slipped through untouched. Oil continued to flow from Southeast Asia to the home islands. Japanese soldiers sailed to the front unhindered, reinforcing garrisons that might otherwise have collapsed. The United States had the doctrine, the submarines, and the crews, but not the functioning weapons required to fight a war beneath the surface. It was in this context, amid failure, frustration, and a Navy unwilling to admit its own mistakes, that a single officer began listening carefully to the men whose lives depended on these torpedoes. His name was Charles Lockwood, and he was about to change everything. By early 1943, the crisis had reached a point where denial was no longer an option. Reports from every theater described the same failures with unnerving consistency. Torpedoes ran too deep. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely. Contact exploders crumpled on impact. The submarine force, despite its courage and skill, was fighting with weapons that could not be trusted. And then Charles Lockwood arrived at Pearl Harbor. Lockwood was no desk-bound admiral. He had commanded submarines since before the First World War, had breathed the stale air of steel compartments for decades, and understood the instincts of men operating in silence beneath the waves. Unlike the Bureau of Ordnance, he believed his captains. He listened, and he began to test everything the Navy had taken for granted. The results were damning. Test shots fired into fishing nets revealed that the Mark 14 torpedoes were running nearly 11 feet deeper than set enough to pass harmlessly under most targets. Lockwood submitted report after report until even the Bureau in Washington was forced to repeat the tests. Their findings confirmed what submariners had already risked their lives to prove. The Navy's primary undersea weapon was fundamentally flawed. But depth was only the first layer of the problem. In April 1943, the USS Tunney fired 10 torpedoes at Japanese carriers at close range. 7 detonated prematurely, brilliant white flashes exploding hundreds of yards short of the target. The next day, the submarine Pompon attacked Shokaku, only to experience the same heartbreaking failures. Each premature detonation was not just a technical malfunction, it was a lost opportunity in a war where opportunities were rare and costly. The breaking point came with the USS Tenosa. Commander Dan Daspit found the Tonan Maru, No. 3, dead in the water, an enormous factory ship with no escorts and nowhere to run. His first salvo crippled her, but in the calm, perfect firing conditions that followed, 9 consecutive torpedoes struck and failed to explode. Daspit's decision to bring the last unexploded torpedo back to Pearl Harbor proved transformative. Engineers discovered that the firing pin inside the contact exploder collapsed under the force of a direct hit. The more accurate the shot, the more certain the failure. This revelation tore away the last illusions. The Mark 14 had not been adequately tested. Its components were fragile. Its systems interfered with one another. It was, as Lockwood would later write, a beautiful piece of engineering on paper. Pearl Harbor's machine shops worked through the night. They redesigned the firing pin, replaced unreliable components, and began issuing modified torpedoes across the fleet. By late 1943, the first submarines armed with these corrected weapons sailed into the Pacific. For the first time since the war began, the men beneath the waves carried torpedoes that behaved as advertised. And when the weapons worked, everything changed. Accuracy turned lethal. Tactics that once produced only frustration now yielded results. The U.S. submarine campaign against Japan shifted from cautious probing to aggressive, coordinated strikes. What had once been a flawed experiment was becoming the most devastating undersea offensive in the history of naval warfare. By the start of 1944, the transformation was unmistakable. With torpedoes that finally ran at the correct depth and exploded on impact, the submarine force no longer fought with hesitation. It fought with purpose. And the targets that mattered most were no longer random merchantmen. They were the tankers that fed Japan's war machine. Japan had entered the conflict with one unavoidable weakness. It possessed almost no domestic oil, every drop of fuel sustaining its fleet, its factories, its aircraft, and its armies had to cross 6,000 kilometers of open ocean from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. There were no pipelines, no alternative land routes, only ships slow, vulnerable, irreplaceable. And in 1944, American submarines began destroying them faster than Japan could build new ones. Cryptographers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had broken Japanese merchant shipping codes. Submarines now knew when tankers sailed, what cargo they carried, and which routes they would take. Boats waited at choke points near Singapore, the Philippines, and the home islands, silent hunters positioned precisely where Japan's lifeline narrowed to a thread. The results were devastating. In the first half of 1944 alone, American submarines sank 27 of the 43 tankers Japan lost. By year's end, 2/3 of the Japanese tanker fleet had been destroyed. Oil production in Southeast Asia surged under Japanese occupation, yet most of it never reached the home islands. The empire was drowning in crude it could not transport. The consequences rippled through every aspect of Japan's military planning. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the carrier fleet, discovered that fuel shortages were so severe he could not train his aircrews in home waters. He was forced to relocate the fleet to Singapore, closer to Borneo and Sumatra's oil fields, but thousands of miles from the decisive battles unfolding in the Central Pacific. His pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, would face American forces at a crippling disadvantage. The reckoning came in June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Waves of Japanese aircraft rose into the sky, flown by men who had practiced over calm tropical waters and had never encountered the concentrated firepower of an American task force. They were met by seasoned Hellcat pilots and overwhelming anti-aircraft barrages. The slaughter became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost nearly 500 aircraft and the majority of its remaining trained aviators. Submarines struck as well. Albacore sank the fleet carrier Taiho, while Kavala sent Shokaku to the bottom. Japan's naval air arm never recovered, yet the human cost extended far beyond pilots and carriers. Japan's troop transports packed so tightly that soldiers slept in tiered bunks known as silkworm shelves became floating coffins. When American submarines intercepted them, casualties often exceeded 1,000 lives in a single sinking. Entire divisions disappeared beneath the waves before reaching the front. According to post-war assessments, more than 97,000 Japanese soldiers were killed at sea, though the true number may be higher. Records were incomplete. Many ships simply vanished into silence. By early 1945, the collapse was absolute. Oil imports had fallen to a trickle. Warships lay immobilized in port, unable to sortie. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. The last tanker from Southeast Asia reached Japan in March. After that, nothing. The arteries of an empire had been severed, and the nation that once dreamed of ruling the Pacific was slowly suffocating beneath the waves. For the United States, the submarine war in the Pacific became both a triumph of innovation and a testament to sacrifice. When the weapons finally worked, American submarines in World War II delivered results that reshaped the conflict. But those results came at a cost as staggering as the successes themselves. The Silent Service suffered the highest casualty rate of any American branch during the war, approximately 22%. 52 submarines never returned, vanishing into the vastness of the Pacific with more than 3,500 men aboard. No wreckage, no final reports, no triumphant homecoming, just silence. To serve in the submarine force was to accept the possibility that one's first patrol might also be one's last. Charles Lockwood understood this better than anyone. He saw his captains return from patrol sunburned, sleep-deprived, and hollow-eyed from weeks of tension. He also saw the empty berths of those who never came home. Under his leadership, the submarine base at Pearl Harbor became not only a center of operations but a sanctuary. Lockwood arranged rest camps where crews could recover, ensured that returning boats were greeted with fresh vegetables and ice cream, and secured the Royal Hawaiian Hotel as a rest facility. These gestures, small in scale but immense in meaning, reflected a commander who fought just as fiercely for his men as he did against the Japanese fleet. The global implications of the U.S. submarine campaign against Japan were equally profound. Before the war, many naval strategists believed that decisive battles between surface fleets would determine the fate of nations. Echoes of Tsushima, Jutland, and Mahan's sea power doctrines. Instead, the Pacific submarine warfare campaign demonstrated a radically different truth. A relatively small force, equipped with the right intelligence and reliable weapons, could strangle an island empire without ever fighting a traditional fleet engagement. This revelation reverberated far beyond 1945. The submarine became the strategic equalizer of the modern era, stealthy, lethal, difficult to counter, and capable of altering national destinies without warning. In the years that followed, every major naval power reshaped its doctrine to reflect the lessons learned at such terrible cost. And yet behind every statistic lies a human story. Men like Dudley Mush Morton, whose daring transformed the USS Wahoo into a legend before he and his crew were lost forever. Men like Richard O'Kane, who survived the sinking of the USS Tongue, only to endure captivity and later emerge as the top-scoring American submarine commander of the war. Their courage and the sacrifice of their crews formed the backbone of a campaign that rewrote the rules of naval warfare. In the final months of the war, as Japan's harbors filled with warships that could no longer sail and aircraft that could no longer fly, the truth of what had happened beneath the Pacific became impossible to ignore. A handful of undersea boats, less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, had accomplished what no surface armada or air fleet could achieve alone. They had severed the arteries of an empire. They had turned the vastness of the Pacific into a battlefield, where silence itself was a weapon. The night the Shinano slipped beneath the waves, taking more than 1,000 men with her, was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbol of the transformation that had reshaped the war. American submarines in World War II had once struggled with torpedoes that failed at the moment of truth. Now they were powerful enough to send the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine to the ocean floor. The sinking of Shinano was the culmination of a campaign built not on spectacle, but on unrelenting pressure, patient stalking, precise attacks, and the quiet resolve of crews who knew the odds and went anyway. Yet the true legacy of the U.S. submarine campaign against Japan cannot be measured only in tonnage sunk or fuel denied. It lives in the stories of the men who never surfaced, the crews entombed in steel hulls, resting in silent canyons of the Pacific, the letters never delivered, the families who waited for news that would never come, Their sacrifice gave the Pacific submarine warfare campaign its moral weight, the understanding that victory was carried on the backs of those who risked everything beneath the waves. After 1945, new generations of naval planners studied these events closely. They learned that power could be shaped by what remained unseen. They recognized that a nation dependent on the sea could be defeated not by a decisive clash of fleets, but by a long, patient tightening of the noose. In this way, the men of the silent service changed far more than the outcome of a single war. They changed the meaning of sea power for all time. If this story resonates with you, we invite you to join the conversation. What lessons from this campaign do you believe matter most today? Share your perspective below. Our community spans veterans, families, and history enthusiasts who help keep these memories alive. And if you wish to continue exploring the untold chapters of the past, consider subscribing. History endures because we choose to remember it. The battle beneath the waves may be long over, but its echoes still shape the world we live in.